This is just the beginning.
Welcome to this Axios virtual event, Facts Matter, Our Unfolding Economy. I'm Mike Allen, a co-founder of Axios, coming to you from my home in Arlington, Virginia. I'll be joined by my Axios colleagues. We thank USA Facts for making these conversations possible, and we thank you for joining us across the many platforms of Axios events. We'd love for you to follow along on Twitter at Axios, hashtag Axios Events. Our first guest is Larry Kudlow, President Trump's economic advisor, coming to us from his White House office. You know Larry Kudlow from CNBC, where he was a primetime host. He started his career at the New York Fed, worked in the Reagan White House, worked on Wall Street at Bear Stearns, worked in publishing at National Review, was a columnist, has done it all, has taken more than 121 COVID tests there in the West Wing. I love that he counts them. Larry Kudlow, welcome to Axios.
Thank you, Mike.
So Larry, as we were getting mic'd up, you were just saying there's not going to be a stimulus deal before the election. What happened to those negotiations?
Well, I think, look, two things quickly. One is the talks are still going on, all right? We're still talking. On the other hand, our team increasingly believes that their team is not serious about making the necessary compromise to get a deal. That's increasingly the view. It's been in good faith, but now we get down to the last days, and we don't feel like they just have any real interest in putting a package together. And it's too bad, because I will tell you this, there are 3 or 4 things, targeted assistance areas, that would help COVID and would help the economy.
Putting aside whose fault it is, you think the president will pay a political price for the fact that this didn't get done, that this relief is not in the pipeline?
No, I don't think he will. I think people realize, we've come a long ways toward compromise. And the president has said in key areas, he would be willing to spend more money in key areas. The problem here is so much of the other team's proposal has really nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with the economy. It's a political and ideological sources. And I don't disrespect their views. I don't agree with them, but I respect their views. I'm just saying, why now? We should have been directed the assistance. I mean, we're going to have an election over these ideological issues, but why now? We should have done this in July to help small businesses, unemployment assistance, the airlines, the schools. It could have been done with standalone appropriation bills, but alas, we just don't see any progress.
And Larry, you worked in the Reagan administration. You're there in the West Wing. You know the power of the presidency. Why didn't the president exert that power? Why didn't he use his convening power, his pulpit power to pull this off?
Well, look, don't forget, please, going back to mid-July when these talks heated up in earnest, nothing happened. And the president, a month or 6 weeks later, decided to put his own executive orders in place. We're trying to use all the levers of power in the executive branch that we had.
Well, Larry, as you look ahead, facts matter, and it's a fact that the Congressional Budget Office says that in this year, the federal debt will be nearly 100% of the gross domestic product. It will be more than that in the next 2 years. That's going to mean real constraint for future policy makers and for the government now.
Well, look, I would agree with you in normal times. And I'm a supply sider. I'm a fan of smaller government. But the reality is, in this kind of emergency, it's a once in 100-year emergency, the president decided to use every lever of federal power he could to assist people, to provide liquidity, to get us through this pandemic. And of course, the mitigation led to the transaction, the shut-in of the economy. That's what federal government is there for. I thought it was a leadership move.
We were talking earlier about what went wrong with the negotiations and what levers the president tried, but what people care about is results. And people look at what's coming out of Washington right now, and they see frozen, broken.
Well, look, I can't. It's a disappointment. There's no question it's a disappointment. All I can say is we did our best to negotiate. Steve Mnuchin, Secretary Mnuchin, is a dear friend of mine. He's a terrific negotiator. And we came a long way towards the other side's position. Look, I think you have to look forward, Mike. All right, the election is Tuesday. We'll see. But if the president gets reelected, he is going to stay in the same policies: lower taxes, deregulation, protecting energy independence, tough, fair, and reciprocal trade deals. Those policies gave you 3 years pre-pandemic of a boom. The Census Bureau, the Federal Reserve, I know you're talking about facts. Those are facts. Family income, average family income up $6,500 in 3 years. That beat the prior administration's 8 years by 5-fold. Real wages went up for the first time. The unemployment rate hitting record lows across the board, every single category, record lows, okay? African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asians, women, across the board. Poverty rate went down. Inequality rates went down. I mean, look, the key point here, I'm very proud of this, and I believe the president will continue this if he is reelected. His policies, the tax cuts and the deregulation especially, the people who benefited, Mike, were those that needed it the most. And those are facts. It was the middle class and the lower rungs of the income ladder who had the biggest gains under President Trump. It was not just for rich people. I have nothing against rich people. And in fact, President rewards success. He doesn't punish it. But if you look at those numbers, these are government statistics. They're facts. All right. It's like the least among us got the most benefits. And that is the design of a terrific policy. And we are on the road to a long-term prosperity. And I think we can pick up on that. I think we can pick up on that once we get through this difficult period.
You said, look, let's look forward, looking at the president's second term agenda, put it out this summer. There were a few specific lines. He said 10 million new jobs, 1 million new small businesses, 1 million jobs back from China. But it was mostly very vague. Return to normal in 2021. Like, what does that look like? The AEI, American Enterprise Institute, which is no foe of the administration, put out a 12-page analysis of Joe Biden's tax plan. They said they couldn't score yours because there's not enough detail. Do you think that the campaign should have put more meat on the bone for a second term?
No, I don't. Look, two things on this. First of all, the president has a track record. All right. He's the incumbent. He has a very clear track record with a very clear set of economic principles. And he will provide more of the same. Now, we have talked about important economic policy themes. We are now working on a middle class tax cut. We are working on some additional business tax cuts. We'd like the onshoring an investment tax credit for firms coming back home to America or new firms coming here. We want to pay their moving expenses wherever possible. We want to make the immediate 100% expensing for factories, plants and equipment and buildings. We want to make that permanent. It wasn't in the 2017 bill. Probably try to keep the capital gains tax down, maybe even drop it a little bit for investment purposes. Deregulation. We're going to go back, environmental deregulation, cost-benefit analysis for every single agencies. We want to make sure that banks don't discriminate in their lending policies to anybody. And we want to do more free and fair and reciprocal trade deals. People know what President Trump stands for, and they know the success. The other side, the other team, yes, they put out a little more detail, not much, but a little more. But we don't know what their policies are. They have to do that. The onus is on them. And in fact, they flip-flopped around on key issues, and we've had to go back and check it and show the public. So that's an issue. Now, on the AEI price out, I get that. But look, the Hoover Institute at Stanford, Kevin Hassett, Casey Mulligan, and so forth, they priced out the Obama plan such as we know, and they feel it will lose 5 million jobs. It will lose almost 10% of gross domestic product. And the middle income family gain of $6,500 will evaporate. So their price out was much tougher than AEI's. The Tax Foundation price out was similar to the Hoover price out.
Okay, so we got the think tank wars. going here. Larry, I mentioned you came off of Wall Street. You were chief economist at Bear Stearns. Front page of the Wall Street Journal this week, Wall Street warms to Biden. Big part of it, of course, is the certainty. That must pain you.
Well, look, I've been off Wall Street for a while. It is true. I spent some great years there. I think a lot of the leaders of the Wall Street firms have turned to the left. I think they've kind of gone into, I don't want to be too critical of them, but they've become very progressive. I think that if the Biden team wins and we eliminate natural gas and we raise taxes across the board, people on Wall Street may have many, many regrets. For some reason, they don't think Mr. Biden is going to move far left. I think he will. Just look at the people around him. But increasingly, let me just say this. Under Donald Trump, the Republican Party's base constituency is no longer Wall Street. It is really middle America. It is really blue-collar workers. It is really, ordinary folks working every day. The base has changed. The GOP is not the country club party that it was many, many years ago. It has changed. I think it's changed for the better. We will get our share of Wall Street votes. The investor class, over 100 million people, will not want their 401ks and IRAs decimated by high taxes and regulations. So we'll see how all that turns out.
All right, Larry, I'm getting the hook here. So penultimate question for you. One of your many pursuits I didn't mention. You're also an author, and your book, JFK and the Reagan Revolution, what we can learn about prosperity from them. What can the next president, whether it's in a couple months or in 4 years, what can the next president learn about economics from JFK?
Yeah, I love JFK economics. I appreciate you mentioning that. You can still get it on Amazon, one click, although I don't want to make any commercials here. What we can learn from JFK, JFK was the first modern president to lower tax rates across the board. Individuals, corporations, capital gains. He also was a deregulator. And the 1960s, after, tragically he was assassinated, but those tax cuts created a terrific boom in the 1960s. Ronald Reagan essentially borrowed JFK's idea of cutting tax rates across the board. Douglas Dillon was a link between the two men. And Donald Trump has essentially borrowed the JFK formula of lower tax rates across the board. Look, we should be in this for growth and prosperity. We want people to do better, have higher living standards. That's why I'm so proud that those who needed the most got the most benefits from Trump policies before the pandemic. JFK is a very good lesson to Democrat. I reckon he would be a Reagan-Trump Republican if he were around today, but that's my own speculation.
All right, Larry, as we say goodbye, we always finish with one fun thing. And of all the reopenings that we've been watching, there's one particular reopening you've been watching with special interest.
I was thrilled, finally, when the tennis courts were reopened. I was thrilled. I'm an old college tennis player. I love the game. I play all the time now, outdoors, even indoors. I'll still play. I have to wear a mask indoors. I'm happy to do it when it rains. Getting me back on the courts finally last spring, late spring, whatever, was a wonderful miracle. Makes me better. I feel better. I think better. And I'm just better. I love tennis. So tennis is in now, folks. It's good. You can do it your whole life.
That should be your next book. Larry Kudlow, Just Better.
Thank you, sir.
Larry Kudlow, thank you for joining Axios.
Thanks, Mike. My pleasure.
We appreciate USA Facts making these conversations possible. And now we're going to go over to Alexandria, to Axios CEO Jim Vandehei for A View from the Top.
Thank you very much, Mikey. It is now my pleasure to bring you a conversation with Steve Ballmer, who is the founder of USA Facts. Steve, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great, Jim. How are you doing?
I'm excellent. For those that don't know, explain what USA Facts is and why you're dedicating so much of your life to it.
USA Facts is an initiative I started, I guess, almost 5 years ago now after I retired from Microsoft as CEO. And I was trying to understand, my wife and I were figuring out where to go with our philanthropy, and I was trying to understand how much money government really invested in anti-poverty and programs for economic mobility, and I found it was very hard to understand. I just want to understand where government revenue came from. In other words, who's paying taxes, what the money's spent on, and what kind of outcomes are we getting. And my first assertion after banging around for a while on the internet is it would be great to have something like the documents, the 10K reports, the annual reports that government produces, makes business produce rather, for its shareholders. And I thought, hey, as a citizen, I'd like to see the same thing. And we started on an initiative to create those kinds of information.
It's a great cause, right? That you've got so much misinformation out there. You have memes and you have mayhem, but you don't often have fact-based conversation anymore, which I think is a huge problem for government. Looking at it just from a fact-based prism, looking at the data that you've been able to compile, how should we think about this moment 7 months into the coronavirus, given the economic consequences, the health consequences of it? What do the numbers tell us?
Well, it's important for me to say I'm not going to make an adjective conclusion as to whether things are good or bad. I'm merely going to talk from the numbers because, in a sense, numbers really are nonpartisan, which is great. Unemployment claims are down by nearly half. I think people would find that good. The deficit has ballooned this year to about $2.5 trillion. Some people might think that is bad, if you will. Personal spending is almost up to where it is, and savings is up, and income is up because of the CARES Act. People can see that in a variety of different ways. If you look at policy across states, one interesting way to think about it is what's the unemployment per COVID case? An interesting way to see things, because some economies, some states have obviously been tight and some have been looser. And you can see that Hawaii's got the highest. It's about 12 jobs lost for every COVID case. And then if you look at the same numbers, for example, in Mississippi or Texas, it would be less than a tenth of that.
And in terms of the stimulus, right? A lot of the things that you talked about, a lot of the reality-based facts, they came from the stimulus, right? That helped get more money, more liquidity into the system, affected how much people have in their bank accounts, how much they can spend. Obviously, Congress failed to get another deal. What do the numbers tell you about the effect of the stimulus and now the absence of a stimulus, maybe by ethnicity? Like, what do you see as you dig into the numbers that might be surprising to us?
Yeah, let's start with the overall trajectory, which may be, I think, more encouraging than some people would think. The stimulus was obviously a major factor. We saw the decline in unemployment claims not the decline in unemployment claims, the decline in unemployment start to occur as the government started putting stimulus back into the economy. Obviously, the stimulus for business, the PPP program, was undoubtedly a part of that. And things have continued to trend it down. What does that mean in terms of what we need for a second stimulus package? Well, that's what our politicians are trying to figure out now. But I'm glad that the lines are still headed in the right direction, which means things are continuing to improve, at least in terms of people's ability to spend money. Housing scarcity, food scarcity are all going the right direction. There are two things that I think are worth highlighting. The impact on the Latinx community, the Hispanic ethnicity, if you will, by government numbers, the Black community, African American, those numbers have improved far less than the numbers have improved for white Americans or Asian Americans. They are improving also, but they have definitely improved less, which is a cause for concern, at least in my personal judgment, for sure.
What do the numbers tell us about the why, right? It always seems like that, like whatever happens, it always like, oh, well, whites benefited more than African Americans or Hispanics. Like, what do the numbers tell us in terms of the why? Like, not the political argument, but like the what do the numbers say about why is that? Why is it so stubbornly persistent?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Economists will look in and they'll come up with theories of what moves what. My skepticism as a business person is you can find an economist on one side that'll tell you one explanation and an economist on the other side that will give you another explanation. So rather than try to look at causality, I think we should just stare at our numbers in the face. Household income for African Americans is about median is about 33,000 plus a year. That same number for white Americans is 70, if I remember off the top of my head, about 78,000. That is the facts. You know, how we got there, I think people can talk and look at the racism that has existed in this country, but that is the fact today. And at least now, this is my personal judgment. It's not a USA Facts. That is really not acceptable.
You ran Microsoft very successfully. You now sit here and you stare at these numbers. When you look at the numbers, people are just like wringing their hands. They feel like the whole world sometimes is going to hell in a handbasket. Like when you look at the numbers, what numbers give you the most hope?
Yeah, I think there's some numbers that we can really be excited about. Yes, we still have a problem with carbon emissions, and yet carbon emissions per person has come down significantly. Significantly is an adjective. I prefer numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head, but usafacts.org. You will see that, and you might feel good about that. I'd put a punctuation mark on that. We started to see improvements in median income per household. The thing people often forget is quality of life is a combination of median income per household plus government transfers and supports of somebody. And what we've really seen for the middle class is taxes are down, government transfers are up, and so the overall ability to spend on one's lifestyle, inflation adjusted, is up. I could be very positively encouraged by that. GDP per person, it's growing at a less fast rate than it was 20 years ago, but it continues to rise. Now, people can like or not like how that's balanced across people in our economy, but at least we have the raw material to think about those problems in our economy. So I'd highlight those, and believe me, I can also point out to some things, Jim, that are far less positive.
We're going to end on a happy note, Steve. Thank you, and thank you for USA Facts for making a conversation that is fact-based, is database possible. I do think when people sort of get over the hangover of the election, I think you and I both agree, we hope that people start just looking at what is the data and what are the things that we actually have to do, and maybe approach government more like a CEO would approach Microsoft and as a political warrior. So thank you for this conversation, Steve, and thank you for the work that you guys do.
Appreciate it, Jim. Thank you for the work you guys do.
Appreciate it. Over to you, Hans.
Hello, I'm Hans Nichols. I'm a political reporter at Axios, and we're lucky enough to be joined now by the policy director for the Biden campaign, Stef Feldman. She's joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Stef, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Hans. Glad to be here.
Let's just jump right into some numbers. On Thursday, we got the GDP report on a quarterly basis, up 7.4%. When you look at the state of the economy, if Joe Biden wins, what sort of economy will he be inheriting in January?
Yeah, so let's step back and take a look at what this number really means. So we know a couple of things. First, we know that our economy plunged into a recession because of President Trump's failure to have a plan to get the virus under control. We also know that President Trump still doesn't have a plan, and we still haven't recovered. These Q3 growth numbers show us that the Q3 growth wasn't enough to pull us out of the ditch that President Trump drove us into. In fact, even with today's report, GDP still remains $6,000 per household below its pre-crisis level. We also know that the recovery is stalling, according to economists from organizations ranging from Moody's to Goldman Sachs to Brookings. And we know that the recovery is K-shaped, meaning it is helping those at the top, but not the tens of millions of working families. That's the economy that Biden will hopefully inherit in January, and it's an economy that will be in dire need of the Biden plan.
Now, you talk about the dire need. Your colleague Jared Bernstein has talked about a fiscal bridge, a short-term stimulus get anything done in the lame duck or in the next few days, how big do you expect that short-term spending deal to be?
So, well, we know a couple of things. We know that the data shows that the labor market and job growth is weakening. We know that COVID is crushing small businesses. And we also know that top economists are sounding the alarm that we're headed for a double dip recession. So we are going to need a sizable plan that really prioritizes investing in working families. What I know is Vice President Biden, if elected, will get to work right away with congressional leadership to provide the type of relief that working families need, which, as far as I can tell, is something that President Trump has not engaged in seriously at all.
So is that sizable package that you just talked about on day one, is that the $3 trillion Build Back Better, or are you thinking of two different packages, one to sort of take care of the immediate need and the other one for longer term growth?
So Vice President Biden is going to get to work right away, and not even waiting until inauguration day, but right away, if he is elected, to provide two things: the immediate fiscal relief our economy needs and our families need to put food on the table, to pay their electricity bills, to keep roofs over their heads, as well as the bigger package to, as you said, build back better, and make sure that on the other side of this crisis, we have an economy that is stronger and more inclusive, tackles issues like climate change and a caregiving crisis, and really works for working families.
You know, the former vice president has also talked about a big tax package, and he has some tax increases in there to pay for some of this, but I think it's also just in the rubric of tax reform. But if the economy is as dire as, you know, you're painting it out to be, and we all expect it to be, is it the right time to raise taxes?
So I think it is absolutely the right time to enact the Biden tax agenda, which, to be clear, won't increase taxes on anyone making less than $400,000, but will make sure that the super wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. And the reason it's the right time is because, as I said, we're in the midst of a K-shaped recovery in which the super wealthy and big corporations are doing better than ever. In fact, increasing profits over the last few months. That's not happening for low income and working families. And by the way, Moody's looked at Biden's entire plan as if it was all implemented from day one. And Moody's found that the Biden plan will create 18.6 million jobs, which is 7 million more than Trump, and lead to nearly $1 trillion more in GDP. So I think, in fact, we can't afford not to enact the Biden plan right away.
Okay, so enact it right away. Does that mean it would affect, or would it not go into effect until 2022?
So Biden is eager to enact and implement his plan as soon as possible. He's going to go straight to work. And, you know, I think our working families can't afford to wait for some of the investments that Vice President Biden wants to make with the revenue he will raise by making sure that big corporations and the super wealthy, which is those making over $400,000, pay their fair share.
Now, Chuck Schumer, who could end up being majority leader, we'll know in a couple of days. He's talked about erasing that $10,000 limit that Donald Trump put in for some states, so you can't deduct more than $10,000. Is that something Biden would consider agreeing to if it meant bringing Chuck Schumer aboard?
Yeah, so I'm going to let Senator Schumer and Biden work together to develop a package that delivers relief for working families. I'm not going to get ahead of their conversation, so I appreciate the question. And I know that Vice President Biden will prioritize working with all of congressional leadership if he gets elected, which, as I said, seems to be the opposite of President Trump, who refuses to engage in any conversations with congressional leaders to try to get fiscal relief out of the door, which is just unacceptable.
So I'm hearing that you're not ruling out what Schumer wants, which is the $10,000 deduction, that limit to go away. Did I hear you right?
You are hearing me say that, we have rolled out incredibly comprehensive plans. I am not going to roll out any additional policy right now. We know what the American people need. Vice President Biden has put it forward, and he is going to get right to work working with leaders across Congress to make it happen.
One question on sort of the deductibility on the corporate side is, are you considering deducting interest as well? That was a big change. And, former economist, CEA Chair Jason Furman is a big proponent of this. Is that something that's on the table?
Yeah, so from my understanding, the tax bill in 2017 already limited deductibility. And what the vice president is focused on right now, Vice President Biden, is raising the 28%, raising the corporate rate to 28%, rewarding onshoring and penalizing companies that shift jobs overseas. So that's the big, bold Biden plan to make sure that big corporations pay their fair share.
But any changes to the current deductibility rules on interest payments?
The Biden plan right now is focused on raising that rate to 28%. And, I'm sure there will be a lot of details worked out as the vice president works with members of Congress to enact his agenda. But right now, he has a clear path forward to make sure that we are balancing the fact that we need to make sure that corporations pay their fair share, which, we know they haven't under the Trump administration. We know that 91 corporations in 2018 under the Trump tax agenda paid $0 in taxes. And Vice President Biden just doesn't think we can let that stand.
Can we do a speed round on some of the numbers just so I understand the tax plan better? You've just mentioned bringing the corporate tax rate from, it's currently 21% up to 28%. How much revenue do you guys think you get for that over 10 years?
Yeah, so I understand the interest everyone has in getting line by line scoring on all this. I'm not going to get into a line by line discussion of each tax reform, but I will say, what our team has been working hard on is consulting official scores and working with experts throughout the campaign. And so we are confident that these pay-fors can meet Vice President Biden's goal of offsetting all of his long-term fiscal agenda. And that is to make sure that we have the revenue we need to make big, bold investments in things like public education and infrastructure and building a clean energy economy.
So that will be 1-to-1. Whatever he does for long-term investment, it will all be offset by his tax plan. Did I hear you right there?
Vice President Biden is committed to make sure that every long-term spending plan he has is paid for by making sure that those making more than $400,000 and big corporations pay their fair share. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go back to the earlier part of the conversation where we talked about two bills, a one for short-term relief and long-term relief. With the short-term relief, would you need to offset that 1-to-1 by additional tax revenues?
So the short-term relief needs to get out the door as quickly as possible. And I think all of the other details regarding how it is designed will be worked out between Vice President Biden and hopefully Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. What I do know is that money will be directed and targeted under a Biden administration to middle class and lower class families. It'll be targeted to our smallest businesses instead of just the big corporations that have the best connections to big banks. And Vice President Biden is going to be focused on making sure that we get that relief done quickly because families can't wait. And I think they're tired of waiting under President Trump.
Will that be more or less than $1 trillion?
Again, I'm not going to get ahead. I understand the interest, but I'm not going to get ahead of a hopeful Vice President Biden and congressional leadership. I think the choice is pretty clear to the American people right now, what a Biden administration agenda looks like compared to a Trump administration agenda.
Two final quick questions. Can you rule yourself out as the next Treasury Secretary?
I have worked for Vice President Biden for over a decade, and he is a great boss, so I would do whatever he asks, but I am not expecting to be Treasury Secretary.
Will the next Treasury Secretary be a female?
Well, that's also a question for Vice President Biden to answer. He is committed to having a strong woman across his administration, including doing economic policy. So excited to have a woman be his vice president. I have no doubt that he will continue his record of making sure that he is getting advice from a cabinet and an entire administration that looks like the diversity of this country.
Okay, Stef, we'll take that. We'll take all your answers. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us. And with that, I'm going to send it over to my colleague, Nyla, who I talked to late at night and also early in the morning. Nyla?
Thank you, Hans, who also works day and night, especially when it comes to our morning podcast. Hi, everyone. My name is Nyla Boodoo, and I am the host of said podcast at Axios Today. Our final guest is the chief economist at the Conference Board, Dana Peterson, who's joining us from New York, New York. Hi, Dana. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Dana, let's just get right into it because I think a lot of people are really focused on yesterday's GDP numbers and the record growth. And just sort of in context, we know that's not back to pre-pandemic levels when it comes to economic growth. And I wanted to actually start by asking you about something that might have got less attention yesterday, which was that the Labor Department also released initial unemployment claim data for last week. And we saw more Americans applying for unemployment benefits last week than in any week in the Great Recession or any prior recession. And I wonder how much you think where we're at sort of in context with job losses in the labor market right now.
Sure, that's a great question. Indeed, we saw very rapid gains in employment over the summertime, and that was also reflected we think in yesterday's GDP data, where the economy seemed like it was coming back online. But a lot of those easy gains are probably over. Indeed, we're seeing jobless claims continue to be elevated. And certainly many businesses are signaling that they're looking to either let go of workers that are currently on furlough or introduce new layoffs. And so certainly we anticipate that there could be, continued grudging gains in terms of chipping away at the unemployment rate and seeing higher employment.
And when we're thinking about this, we know that job losses have been most acute when we're thinking about women, people of color, younger workers, lower skilled workers. What is your outlook on that front? Not good?
Well, a lot of it has to do with labor market segmentation. When you look at younger workers, many of them work in services sectors like recreation, entertainment. When you look at women, many of them work in education and healthcare. These are all sectors, as well as hotels and restaurants and airlines. Many of these sectors I would call play sectors, or sectors that are very highly discretionary in nature and are not amenable to social distancing. So we've seen a lot of those sectors suffer and probably will take much longer to come back relative to other sectors that did not, that were not as hard hit by the pandemic economic downturn.
And when we're thinking about that, what are you all thinking in terms of a forecast of any kind of return to normal levels, given that we're still in such an uncertain time, and in fact, a really bad time when we're looking at coronavirus cases and numbers and hospitalization and unfortunately death rates?
Indeed, we anticipate that the U.S. economy probably will contract by 3.5 percentage points in 2020, but then bounce back by 3.5 percentage points, so recouping most of the losses next year. But we don't anticipate that we will return to the pre-pandemic level of activity until probably sometime in the fourth quarter of next year. So still many more quarters of weakness. And again, like I said, grudging gains on the labor market front as well as on the growth front. But what's going to be very important are two elements. First of all, the extent to which governments reopen businesses and allow mobility both internally and externally, as well as the widespread availability of treatments and vaccines that can help quell the fear factor.
So we've got the pandemic, but I also wanted to ask you about your research, which looks at quantifying the economic cost of racism, specifically as it relates to Black Americans, which has been, I think, another theme of this year, not just the pandemic, but talking about racial injustice. I wanted to just ask you first, why was it important for you to start down this line of research?
Sure. I actually wrote that report when I was back at Citigroup. I'm just fairly new at the conference board, but nonetheless, the impetus behind that was to respond to what we were seeing, certainly with the protests in reaction to a series of very negative events among Black people and also the police. And we felt that it was important to think about racial inequalities on an economic front and to quantify these gaps in terms of dollars and numbers, which we felt would be a great way to communicate what was going on to our clients, but also to the rest of the world.
And so as an economist, I wonder how important it is, you think, to have a specific number. In this case, $16 trillion we're talking about in economic input since 2000. That's how much closing the racial gap when it comes to Black Americans would mean.
Sure. I think, numbers are a little bit more difficult to argue with than morality, certainly. And when we're thinking about the fact that the US economy over the last 2 decades has struggled to maintain growth above 3%, you have to think about where some areas that we could have addressed such that we could have added a few tenths of growth every year. And certainly in this post-pandemic environment, yes, we're seeing these very wild numbers, but when we come out of the pandemic, what pace of growth will we have? And certainly, if you think about these gaps with respect to housing, income, wages, access for businesses to credit, I mean, these are really sizable gaps and amounts that really add up in terms of GDP growth.
And so we had a question from an audience member that I wanted to bring up from San Juan, Puerto Rico, that asked, how can we rewire society for a more inclusive future? And I'm going to take the liberty of moderating that question to, how do you think we can rewire our economy for a more inclusive future?
Sure. There's no silver bullet here. We must tackle these issues on multiple fronts. So, for example, when you think about access to banking, many people are unbanked. And so certainly the central bank as well as individual banks can do more in terms of making sure that people have access to credit and that they're not being denied for reasons that could potentially be linked to some kind of bias. So that's an example. Also, enabling people to have access to housing, especially affordable housing. So there are many different areas. And certainly when you think about corporations and what corporations can do, corporations can think about whether or not their employees who are doing the same work are all being compensated in the same way, and that all of their employees have access to training as well as to advancement. So there are many different areas here that can be tackled on a multitude of fronts.
How important or how possible do you think it is to do that now in the middle of a pandemic and given everything we've just spent the past 10 minutes talking about, what a pretty bad economic situation we're in?
Well, why not now? Certainly we're looking for solutions here, and certainly we're looking for faster growth. So it's a perfect time for us to address these gaps, especially gaps that have nothing to do with the pandemic. So, for example, if you're not letting go of your workers and you have them all there, are they all being paid equitably? Well, that's a question you won't answer, or you can't answer unless you actually look at the data. You collect the data, you examine the data, and then you act upon those data. And so these are things that can be done whether or not we're in a pandemic or not. But certainly when we're trying to recover, I think we should all be looking for areas for growth.
And how much of this then do you think is about rewiring our mindset, whether we're talking about corporations or as employers, as well as individual people?
I think there needs to be a different way of thinking about these things, and that's why we wrote it in terms of economics. Many times people will make moral arguments, and everyone has a different is on a different spectrum in terms of morality. But certainly when you show people dollars and cents, hard dollars, numbers, it's a little bit more convincing. And certainly I think if we can start there, then people will begin to realize, well, if we make sure that all of our workers are happy, if we're making sure that businesses are having access to credit, households are having access to credit, then that benefits all of us if there's faster GDP growth. So I think if we look at it in terms of what's good for the economy as well as society, then we could definitely make some inroads here.
Can I ask you as an economist to leave us with then one number you want people or businesses to think about when it comes to closing this gap?
Well, I think 16 trillion of losses over the last 20 years from allowing these gaps to persist. I think that's a truly outsized and outstanding figure, and something that we should hopefully not want to repeat over the next 20 years.
Well, thank you so much. Dana Peterson is the chief economist at the Conference Board, joining us from New York. Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that's made us smarter, faster. For the latest news, please follow our dashboard at Axios.com or on the Axios app. You can also sign up for all Axios newsletters at signup.axios.com. Thank you to our sponsor, USA Facts, for making this event possible. And if you like this event, we're going to be hosting 2 more before the end of 2020 with USA Facts to unpack the impact of the pandemic and election results on immigration, healthcare, and more. Thank you all for joining us. You can hear me every weekday morning on the Axios Today podcast, and we'll see you on Axios.com.